Now let's head to Canberra for the latest on tomorrow's budget and the other big stories making news today. I'm joined from Canberra by the political editor of the Australian newspaper, Mr. Dennis Shanahan. Dennis, thank you for your time this evening. Josh Frydenberg has a tightrope to walk tomorrow. On the one hand, he needs to deliver a thoroughly Liberal budget. It can't shirk fiscal responsibility altogether by spending crazily, but it also has to be enough there to lock in that economic recovery, which is already well underway. What's your view of what we're going to see tomorrow?
Rita, I think that one thing we need to look at with this budget, of course the pandemic means that this is a budget completely out on its own. But one thing that Josh Frydenberg is trying to do as Treasurer is use the economy to fix the budget. For over the last 30 years, we've seen Treasurers trying to use the budget to help the economy one way or the other and to reduce debt or deficit or to have increased spending. What Josh Frydenberg is trying to do now at this time of virtually zero interest rates is actually promote economic growth through business investment and job creation to try and take the pressure, the incredible record high pressure on debt and deficit in the budget. So we have to look at it slightly differently. And certainly, as you say, it's meant to be a stimulatory budget designed to keep the economic recovery after the pandemic up and running, but he's also trying to satisfy fiscal conservatives like yourself and saying it's also an austerity budget, that there won't be too much money spent. Well, I think he's on a tightrope. He's trying to present a coalition fiscally conservative budget, but by the same token, it's a Labor light budget where he's out there spending a huge amount of money on aged care, childcare and other support, welfare support, social spending, investment in infrastructure. It is a big spending budget.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And much of it has already been announced over the last few days. Like you mentioned, plenty of spending in there for aged care infrastructure. But are you expecting any surprises tomorrow night? Is there anything that we haven't already got a preview of?
Well, Treasurers normally like to have a rabbit out of a hat. It gives them a headline on budget night. Sometimes it's not a pretty rabbit and sometimes it's a good rabbit. I think that given that the government's gone pretty quiet after the last couple of weeks of fairly extensive portrayals of what's going to be in the budget, to formal announcements today on a whole range of infrastructure projects around the country on roads and so forth, that the government may have something else up its sleeve, but then in the end it may just be a much better economic outlook to provide optimism and confidence for business rather than any great giveaway, any new tax break or any more spending. I think there can't be much more spending than what we've seen already. So it may be a much better than expected forecast for the budget deficit or for debt reduction.
Well, talking about good news for businesses, particularly businesses in the tourism sector, I want to ask you about borders. We're getting all sorts of conflicting messages at the moment. I've got the PM on the one hand talking about Fortress Australia approach, whilst the Treasurer is talking about we need to get migration back up and running to fuel growth. Here was Labor leader Anthony Albanese on this topic this morning.
Yesterday, the headlines in all the papers that people would have seen was doors slammed shut. This morning, it's doors are about to open. So it's very confusing. And for the business community trying to get a handle on future investments and where these issues are going, the government needs to keep a single message for 24 hours.
What do you make of all that, Dennis?
Well, I think Anthony Albanese has a point there. There have been inconsistent messages, and I think that the reason for this is actually, there are multiple layers to it. The first is that it is a very difficult and changing situation. We've had the overlay of the ban on travel from India, which made people very upset and angered a lot of people. The government then said, yes, we can see what's happening here. Scott Morrison decided, no, we're not going to put up with the anger before the budget, have it distract us from the budget. So that's, we've seen, and although the court case has upheld the government's position, they are going to lift the ban on May 15, and we're now going to see repatriation flights. So that's one set of inconsistency that we've seen. The other, of course, is that the pandemic has affected business in different patches. Tourism and hospitality, very hard hit, and they are very keen to see the borders reopened. And so, once again, we saw Fortress Australia, from a health aspect, trying to keep out people who were coming from India or elsewhere with high infection rates, and at the same time, as Anthony Albanese said, opening the doors again, because what the government wants to do is boost targeted areas of business, particularly tourism. In remote areas, we've seen various programs they've tried, but the bottom line for Australia here is that the pandemic is going to change our population demographic for quite some time to come. It's going to have very serious impacts on our immigration levels, our immigration pattern, our workforce, and the birth rate. This is really a major issue for Australia going through for the next few years, and really a few inconsistent messages over a few weeks will probably pale into insignificance as we go into next year, later this year and next year, and look at really large demographic problems as a result of the pandemic.
Dennis Shanahan, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you, Rita.